Forget peace on Earth. This video honors 10 individuals who turned the holidays into a survival challenge and lost. We're tracking pure, voluntary stupidity from improvised explosives to kinetic physics failures. Please treat this as a cautionary tale, not a bucket list. Do not attempt this at home. Here are 10 festive ways to exit the gene pool. Let's inspect the damage. 1. There is a terrifyingly common misconception among the amateur pyrotechnic community, a demographic that overlaps significantly with the hold my beer crowd, that creating a bigger explosion is simply a matter of arithmetic, not physics. Enter Kyle, a 26-year-old aspiring legend whose understanding of thermodynamics was derived entirely from Wile E. Coyote cartoons. It was January 2nd, the post-holiday wasteland where bad decisions thrive, and Kyle had found himself in possession of a staggering quantity of unsold New Year's sparklers. We aren't talking about a few packs. We are talking about 10,000 individual sticks, acquired at a 90% discount because even the store owners knew nothing good could come from that much magnesium in one place. Kyle had seen videos online of people bundling sparklers to create a megatorch, a fountain of fire that looks like a handheld sun. But Kyle, being a man of vision and zero survival instincts, decided that a mere fountain wasn't enough. He wanted a detonation. He wanted a shockwave. He wanted to feel the boom in his molars. So, he spent the better part of a Saturday afternoon in his garage, meticulously stripping the sparklers and arranging them into a dense, cylindrical core the size of a scuba tank. Now, here is the crucial moment where Kyle signed his own death warrant. He decided to structuralize his creation using duct tape. And he didn't just use a little bit. He wrapped the entire bundle in layer after layer of industrial-grade, fiber-reinforced tape, sealing it tighter than a pharaoh's tomb. By doing this, he inadvertently gave a masterclass in unintentional bomb-making. You see, a sparkler burns by releasing hot gas. If the gas can escape, it's a fire. If the gas is trapped inside a rigid, airtight container, like, say, a duct tape sarcophagus, pressure builds up exponentially until the container fails catastrophically. Kyle had essentially built a crude but highly effective pipe bomb. He hauled this gray monolith of stupidity into the center of his backyard, creating a blast radius that uncomfortably included his kitchen window and his neighbor's prize-winning rose bushes. He invited 3 friends over, who, in a rare display of collective intelligence, decided to film from behind a brick wall. Kyle, however, stood right next to the device, armed with a standard Bic lighter and a grin that would be the last thing his face ever did. He didn't use a long fuse. He didn't build a bunker. He just leaned in, treated the fuse like he was lighting a scented candle, and ignited the catalyst. He expected a slow, majestic whoosh. What he got was a physics lesson delivered at the speed of sound. The core temperature instantly spiked to over 2,000 degrees. The gas expanded violently against the tape constraint, and the entire device detonated with the force of an anti-tank mine. There was no burning phase. There was just Kyle. And then there was a pink mist and a crater where the patio used to be. The explosion was loud enough to set off car alarms 3 blocks away and registered as a minor seismic event by the local university. The police report was brief, noting that while Kyle's ambition was to create the ultimate light show, he only succeeded in becoming the show itself, scattering his existence across the neighborhood in a grim confetti of regret and duct tape. 2. Nostalgia is a powerful narcotic, but usually it doesn't kill you unless you try to recreate your childhood joys with the heavy-set body of a middle-aged accountant and the structural engineering skills of a hamster. Meet Gary, a 35-year-old man who looked out at the aftermath of the blizzard of the decade and didn't see a traffic nightmare. He saw an architectural opportunity. The city plows had pushed a monumental mountain of snow onto the cul-de-sac, creating a towering, dirty white heap about 12 feet high. To a child, this is a playground. To Gary, this was the site of the ultimate snow fort, a man cave carved from ice where he could hide from his responsibilities, drink schnapps, and eventually jump out to scare his wife when she returned from her shift. It was a classic prank setup, doomed by a fundamental misunderstanding of glaciology. Gary grabbed a metal shovel and began tunneling into the side of the mound with the enthusiasm of a prison escapee. The problem was the medium he was working with. Gary was picturing the fluffy, airy powder you see in holiday movies. But plow snow is a different beast entirely. It is a dense, heavy sludge mixed with road salt, gravel, and asphalt, which had been compacted by a 10-ton bulldozer and then frozen solid. It has the density of wet concrete. Gary spent 4 hours hollowing out a cavern deep inside the pile, creating a spacious void, but failing to install a single support beam, arch, or safety strut. He essentially created a hollow tooth in a jawbreaker. Satisfied with his icy tomb, he crawled inside, sat on a bucket, and waited for the sound of his wife's Subaru. But physics is a cruel mistress who hates a vacuum. As the afternoon sun hit the dark, dirty snow, the temperature rose just enough to weaken the already precarious bonds in the roof of the tunnel. Without a creak, without a warning rumble, the entire structure gave way. This wasn't like being buried in a drift. It was like having a Volkswagen dropped on your chest. Thousands of pounds of rock-hard snow slammed down, instantly encasing Gary in a form-fitting straitjacket of ice. The real killer here wasn't the cold, it was the pressure. The weight was so immense that it compressed his chest cavity, making it mechanically impossible for his rib cage to expand. He could exhale, but he physically could not inhale. It's called positional asphyxia, and it is a terrifyingly silent way to die. Gary lay there, fully conscious, unable to move a finger or draw a breath, trapped in the dark just 6 feet from the sidewalk where people were walking their dogs. When his wife finally came home, she didn't get scared by a jumping husband. She simply parked her car next to the slightly settled pile of snow, completely unaware that she was parking next to a crime scene committed by gravity. They didn't find him until the next morning when the plow came back to move the pile, turning a winter wonderland into a cautionary tale about why grown men shouldn't dig holes they can't bench press their way out of. 3. The period immediately following Christmas is a time of melancholy, hangover cures, and the disposal of the family Christmas tree. A fire hazard that has been shedding dry needles onto your living room carpet for a month. Most civilized people drag it to the curb for recycling. Travis, however, was a man who believed that fire was the universal solution to waste management, and that safety regulations were just suggestions for people who didn't know how to handle their business. He looked at the 6-foot Douglas fir, now brown and brittle as a mummy's finger, and decided it needed a Viking funeral in the backyard fire pit. This alone isn't fatal. It's just standard suburban boredom. The fatal error occurred because Travis was a man of zero patience and even less scientific literacy. He dragged the tree out, stuffed it into the metal ring, and tried to light a single branch with a match. But it had rained the night before and the wood was damp. A rational human would go get some newspaper, or maybe a splash of lighter fluid. Travis went to the garage and returned with a red 5-gallon jerry can of 87-octane, unleaded gasoline. Now, we need to have a very serious conversation about the properties of gasoline. People think the liquid burns. It doesn't. The vapors burn. And gasoline vapors are heavier than air, invisible, and spread like water. Travis didn't just sprinkle a little on the tree. He upended the can, pouring nearly a gallon of fuel into the dense, dry needles. He soaked the wood, the ground, and in his enthusiastic swinging of the can, he splashed a significant amount onto the fleece material of his own sweatpants. He didn't notice, or maybe he didn't care because he was too busy feeling like a fire god. He tossed the can aside and stood there for about 45 seconds, fumbling in his pockets for his lighter. During those 45 seconds, a massive, invisible pool of explosive gas fumes pooled around the fire pit and crept along the ground, wrapping around his ankles like a deadly, invisible fog. The tree was basically a fuel air bomb, and Travis was standing inside the blast radius. When he finally found his lighter and flicked it, he didn't even have to touch the tree. The spark ignited the vapor cloud instantly. It wasn't a whoosh, it was a thermobaric event. The air around him turned into plasma. The tree disintegrated in a microsecond, but the real issue was that Travis was standing in the center of the cloud. The flames raced up his gasoline-soaked sweatpants faster than his brain could process the concept of regret. The shockwave knocked him backward, but by then, he was a human torch, running a race against chemistry that he had no chance of winning. The neighbors later reported hearing a sound like a sonic boom and seeing a mushroom cloud that looked suspiciously festive. Travis managed to achieve his goal. The tree was definitely gone. Unfortunately, so were his eyebrows, his skin, and eventually, his life, proving once and for all that if you have to use an accelerant to burn a Christmas tree, you are already too stupid to be trusted with matches. 4. There is a very specific, highly dangerous subset of holiday enthusiasm that occurs when redneck engineering meets winter sports, usually resulting in a police report that reads more like a Looney Tunes script than a traffic accident. Let me introduce you to Brody, a 24-year-old thrill-seeker whose confidence was fueled by cheap beer and a complete misunderstanding of Newtonian physics. It was late Christmas Eve, and the streets of his quiet suburban neighborhood were covered in a layer of hard-packed snow that was slicker than a politician's promise. Most people were inside drinking cocoa. Brody, however, was in his garage looking at his Ford F-150 and a discarded floral print sofa destined for the dump. Where a normal person sees trash, Brody saw the Sofa Sleigh 3000. The plan was deceptively simple. Tie the couch to the truck's trailer hitch using a 30-foot heavy-duty tow strap, put Brody on the couch wearing a Santa hat and holding a beer, and drag him around the neighborhood to spread holiday cheer. His driver, a friend named Kyle who shared Brody's single brain cell, agreed that this was a brilliant idea. They set off. At first, it was actually working. The couch slid on the icy asphalt with surprising grace, and Brody was having the time of his life, waving to horrified neighbors like a parade float marshal from hell. But here is where the physics lesson comes in. Specifically, the concept of centripetal force and the whip effect. When a towing vehicle goes around a corner, the object being towed doesn't just follow a neat line. It travels along a wider arc and, crucially, it accelerates. It's the same principle that flings a rider off a mechanical bull or snaps the tip of a whip. As they approached the end of a long straightaway, Kyle decided to pull a sharp U-turn, to head back home. He hit the gas and cranked the wheel. The truck made the turn. The couch, however, became a victim of angular momentum. As the truck whipped around, the sofa didn't just turn. It swung out wide, accelerating from a manageable 20 miles per hour to a terrified 45 in the blink of an eye. Brody stopped waving. The friction of the upholstery failed completely against the ice. The couch drifted sideways, effectively becoming an unguided missile with zero brakes, zero steering, and a passenger whose only safety feature was a polyester cushion. The trajectory of the swinging couch lined up perfectly with the only solid object on the entire street. A decorative, solid concrete planter box sitting on the corner of the Johnsons' lawn. The impact was deafening. The truck kept going for a second, the tow strap went slack, and the sofa disintegrated into a cloud of wood splinters, springs, and floral fabric dust. Brody didn't just fall off. He absorbed the full kinetic energy of the crash, turning from Santa into a crash test dummy instantly. The autopsy revealed that the sudden deceleration against the concrete planter caused massive internal trauma that was incompatible with life or Christmas. Brody wanted to be a legend of winter sports. Instead, he became a cautionary tale about why highway safety laws generally frown upon towing living room furniture at school zone speeds. 5. The attic is a mystical, forbidden zone in the American home. A dusty purgatory where we store memories, broken luggage, and once a year the Christmas decorations. It is also a place that requires a basic understanding of structural engineering, specifically the difference between a load-bearing joist and drywall, which is essentially chalk dust held together by paper and a prayer. Enter Kevin, a 40-year-old father who treated home maintenance with the same casual disdain he reserved for speed limits. It was 2 days before Christmas, and the house was fully decorated, save for one crucial element. In the living room, directly under the soaring vaulted ceiling, stood a magnificent 12-foot artificial spruce. It was a high-end model, built around a rigid, sharpened steel central pole designed to support 50 pounds of heavy ornaments. It was beautiful, but it was missing the star. And the star, naturally, was in the attic. Kevin, annoyed that he had to pause his football game, grabbed the pull-down ladder and ascended into the gloom. Now, anyone who has ever navigated an unfinished attic knows the golden rule. Step only on the wooden beams. The pink stuff is fiberglass that makes you itch for a week, and the gray flat stuff is the ceiling of the room below you, which has the structural integrity of a wet cracker. Kevin knew this, but the box with the star was tucked in a far corner, just out of arm's reach behind a stack of old National Geographics. A rational human would move the magazines or get a stick. Kevin, driven by a lethal combination of laziness and overconfidence, decided to perform a balancing act. He kept one foot on the beam and swung the other leg out for leverage, stretching his body like a bloated gymnast. He grabbed the box. Success. But as he shifted his weight to pull it back, his anchor foot slipped on a patch of slick, sawdust-covered plywood. In a panic, he instinctively put his other foot down to catch himself. Unfortunately, he put it down directly on the gray drywall. The silence of the attic was shattered by a sickening crack. The ceiling gave way instantly under his 200 pounds. Now, usually, falling through a ceiling results in 2 broken legs and a viral video. But remember the tree? The 12-foot steel core tree standing directly below the attic access point? As Kevin plummeted through the cloud of gypsum dust and insulation, gravity guided him with sniper-like precision. He didn't land on the floor. He landed squarely on the apex of the artificial tree. The top section, stripped of its branches to receive the star Kevin was still clutching, acted as a medieval pike. The steel pole impaled him through the torso, suspending him in midair like a gruesome, accidental ornament in his own living room. When his family ran in upon hearing the crash, they found Kevin literally becoming one with the holiday decor in the most horrific way possible. He wanted to top the tree. Instead, the tree topped him, proving that if you're going to ignore gravity and construction physics, you should at least make sure there isn't a metal spike waiting for you at the bottom. 6. There exists a primal, deeply misguided urge in the male psyche to solve every domestic problem with ballistics. If a problem cannot be fixed with duct tape or WD-40, the logic goes, it can definitely be fixed with a 12-gauge shotgun. This brings us to the tragic but predictable saga of Earl, a man who looked at a weather phenomenon and saw it as a personal challenge to his authority as a homeowner. After a week of freezing rain and thawing cycles, a massive jagged icicle had formed on the eaves of Earl's 2-story Victorian house. We aren't talking about a cute little crystal. This was a 60-pound dagger of ice, a widowmaker in the truest sense, hanging menacingly over the front porch steps. Earl's wife, a woman of infinite patience and common sense, suggested calling a handyman or perhaps just knocking it down with a long pole from a safe distance through a second-story window. Earl scoffed at this weakness. "Why pay a guy when I have a Remington?" he declared, grabbing his duck-hunting shotgun from the safe. Earl's plan was simple. Shoot the base of the icicle where it connected to the gutter, shattering it into harmless snow. It was a plan that ignored several key laws of physics, primarily the one that says, what goes up must come down, and its corollary, heavy things fall straight down. Earl marched outside, racked a shell into the chamber, and assessed the geometry. Here is the fatal flaw. To get a clean shot at the connection point without blasting a hole in his own roof or windows, Earl felt he needed a steep angle. He couldn't shoot from far away, so he adjusted his position until he was standing on the porch, almost directly underneath the target, looking nearly straight up. He was confident. He was armed. He was an idiot. He took aim at the root of the ice monster and pulled the trigger. Boom! As a marksman, Earl was excellent. The spread of the buckshot hit the gutter line perfectly, instantly severing the bond between the house and the ice. Earl had exactly 1 split second to feel a surge of triumph as the massive shard detached. But that triumph was cut short by the realization that he had just released a 50-pound anvil of sharp frozen water directly above his own face. Gravity, which works at 9.8 meters per second squared regardless of your intentions, took over immediately. Earl tried to dodge, but human reaction time is simply no match for a falling object when you are staring right at it. The icicle didn't shatter in the air. It fell as a solid spear. It struck Earl with the force of a falling piano, ending his war on winter instantly. The police found him lying on the porch, shotgun by his side, buried under the shattered remains of his icy adversary. He had successfully removed the icicle, so technically the mission was accomplished. But in the process, he won the Darwin Award for most accurate shot with the worst possible outcome. proving that while guns don't kill people, gravity is more than happy to use your own stupidity as a weapon. 7. There is a fundamental law of physics that every off-road enthusiast knows, but which apparently skipped our next hero entirely. Potential energy is just a fancy scientific term for violence that hasn't happened yet. Let me introduce you to Barney, a man whose approach to yard work was defined by a deep spiritual aversion to physical exertion and a complete misunderstanding of how tension works. It was the day after Christmas, a time usually reserved for returning unwanted gifts, but Barney decided it was the perfect moment to wage war against a dead pine tree stump that had been mocking him from the center of his front lawn for 3 years. A normal, rational human being would rent a stump grinder, or perhaps use a shovel and some honest sweat. Barney, however, owned a heavy-duty pickup truck and a dangerously misplaced sense of mechanical confidence. He didn't own a steel chain. Chains are static, predictable, and boring. Instead, Barney dug out a kinetic recovery strap from the back of his garage. For those of you who don't speak redneck engineering, this is essentially a giant, industrial-grade rubber band designed to snatch vehicles out of mud pits by stretching and then violently recoiling. Barney tied one end to the stubborn stump and the other to his truck's trailer hitch. His plan was to floor it, let the strap stretch, and pop the stump out of the earth like a loose tooth. He lined up the truck, put it in four-wheel drive, and mashed the accelerator with the enthusiasm of a drag racer. The truck roared, the tires smoked on the asphalt, and the strap stretched, and stretched, and stretched some more. Now, here is the physics lesson that Barney missed. When you stretch a kinetic strap to its limit against an immovable object, like a frozen stump, you aren't pulling it. You are loading a weapon. You are storing an immense amount of kinetic energy that has to go somewhere. The stump, rooted deep in the frozen earth, didn't budge a single millimeter. However, the metal towing hook on the stump side, which Barney had attached with a rusty bolt he found in a jar, was the weak link in this chain of stupidity. Under thousands of pounds of tension, the metal groaned, deformed, and then snapped. In a fraction of a second, the heavy steel hook, now liberated from the tree, was pulled back by the contracting strap. It didn't just fall to the ground, it was launched directly back at the truck at near supersonic speed, riding the recoil of the strap like a missile. Barney was looking in his rearview mirror, wondering why the tree wasn't moving. He didn't even have time to blink. The steel hook shattered the rear safety glass of the cab, punched through the leather headrest of the driver's seat, and collided with the back of Barney's skull. It was a sniper shot executed by the laws of physics. The truck sat there idling, the strap dangling limp, while Barney slumped over the wheel, a victim of his own attempt to save 20 minutes of digging. The police report noted that while the stump remained perfectly intact, the driver had effectively slingshotted himself into the afterlife, proving that if you try to fight a tree with a rubber band, the tree will usually find a way to hit back. 8. If there is one thing more dangerous than a man with a tool he doesn't know how to use, it's a man with a tool he thinks he knows how to use, combined with the immense pressure of a screaming family on Christmas morning. Meet Arthur, a self-proclaimed handyman whose actual skill set was limited to changing light bulbs and complaining about professional contractor rates. The scenario was a classic holiday nightmare. The temperature had dropped to 10 below zero overnight, and the water pipes in the house had frozen solid. No water for showers, no water for coffee, and a wife who was rapidly losing her holiday spirit. Arthur, desperate to be the hero and save the $300 a plumber would charge, grabbed a propane blowtorch, the kind used for soldering copper, and headed for the crawlspace. For the uninitiated, a crawlspace is the claustrophobic, dirt-floored gap between the ground and the bottom of your house, usually filled with spiderwebs, dust, and 50 years of dry rot. Arthur belly crawled into this dark, confined tunnel, dragging his torch like a soldier going into a trench war against ice. He found the frozen section of the pipe, which was tucked tight against the floor joists. Now, a smart man would use a hairdryer or a heat gun, something flameless. Arthur, however, wanted speed. He fired up the blowtorch, sending a jet of blue flame against the copper. The problem wasn't the pipe, it was the environment. The space was insulated with old, paper-backed fiberglass that was drier than the Sahara, and the air was thick with suspended dust. As Arthur focused on the pipe, the invisible heat plume ignited the paper backing, of the insulation just 6 inches from his face. It didn't start as a small fire. It flashed. The dry dust and paper caught fire instantly, spreading across the underside of the floorboards like a wave of hungry orange water. Suddenly, Arthur wasn't a plumber. He was a steak in a broiler. Panic set in. He tried to scramble backward toward the small square of light that was the exit, but in his flailing terror, his belt loop snagged on a rusty nail protruding from a beam. He was trapped. The fire ate up the oxygen in the small space within seconds, replacing it with thick, toxic black smoke. Arthur screamed for help, but the sound was muffled by the floorboards above, where his family was loudly playing festive Christmas jazz to drown out the stress of the morning. He didn't burn to death immediately. The smoke got him first, rendering him unconscious in that tight, dark coffin of his own making. By the time the fire department cut through the floor, the pipes were definitely thawed, but the house and Arthur were a total loss. He died trying to save a few bucks, paying the ultimate price for bringing open flame into a tinderbox, and leaving behind a very distinct lesson about why thermal dynamics isn't a hobby you pick up on a holiday morning. 9. Alcohol and gravity have a long-standing collaborative relationship when it comes to thinning the herd. But rarely do they work together with such cinematic precision as they did in the case of Chad. Chad was a 25-year-old former fraternity president who still treated every social gathering like it was pledge week, despite being 3 years out of college. It was late on Christmas night, the party was winding down, and the boredom was setting in. Chad, fueled by a dangerous amount of spiced rum and a recent viewing of a certain classic holiday movie involving a kid defending his home against burglars, looked at the grand, sweeping wooden staircase in his parents' foyer and had a vision. "I bet I can surf that," he announced, a sentence that is statistically the prologue to a traumatic brain injury. He didn't have a sled, obviously, so he improvised. He went to the laundry room and returned with a large, rigid plastic laundry basket, the kind with the slick, polished bottom designed to slide easily across floors. He placed it at the very top of the landing. His friends, who were equally intoxicated but slightly less suicidal, pulled out their phones to record, unknowingly documenting evidence for the coroner. Chad sat in the basket, knees tucked to his chest, looking like a giant drunk baby. The staircase was hardwood, polished to a mirror shine for the holidays, and it was steep, about 20 steps straight down with no landing in between. Chad pushed off. Now, here is the physics failure. Chad assumed friction would slow him down. He was wrong. The smooth plastic on the polished wood created a coefficient of friction that was effectively 0. He didn't slide, he plummeted. He accelerated instantly to about 20 miles per hour. The ride was smooth, exhilarating even, until he reached the bottom. In the movies, the kid slides out the front door into the soft snow. In reality, the front door was closed and locked. But Chad didn't even make it to the door. Directly at the bottom of the stairs on the opposite wall was a cast iron radiator, a solid, unyielding block of metal painted white to match the trim. Chad hit the bottom step. The basket caught a lip in the rug, and he was launched like a cannonball from a mortar. He flew through the air for approximately 4 feet before his head made direct, unmitigated contact with the fins of the radiator. There was a sickening crunch, like a melon being dropped on concrete. The laughter in the room died instantly. Chad didn't get up. He didn't groan. The sheer kinetic energy of a 200-pound man stopping instantly against cast iron caused a basal skull fracture that turned his lights out before his body even hit the floor. He wanted to be the life of the party. Instead, he became a grim reminder that staircases are for walking, and laundry baskets are for laundry, not for breaking the sound barrier in your foyer. 10. There is a tragic irony in breaking into your own house. You are simultaneously the criminal and the victim, and in Walter's case, you are also the executioner. Walter was a 40-year-old corporate sales manager who hadn't just enjoyed the company holiday party. He had attempted to personally drain the venue's entire supply of spiced rum. He was dropped off by a cab at 2 a.m., swaying in the winter wind, only to realize that his keys were still in his coat pocket, which was currently hanging on the back of a chair at the bar 10 miles away. He lived alone, so knocking was futile. Walter circled his house like a drunk raccoon, looking for a point of entry. He found it around the back, an old wooden sash window on the ground floor that was cracked open just an inch for ventilation. For those who don't know, a sash window is the kind that slides vertically and is counterbalanced by heavy lead weights inside the frame connected by cords. This particular window was original to the 1920s house, meaning the cords were made of century-old cotton that had been rotting since the Jazz Age. Walter pushed the heavy window up. It groaned but held. He didn't have anything to prop it open with, and in his inebriated state, he trusted the window to stay put. He found a crate, stood on it, and began the awkward process of wriggling through. He put his head and arms in first, then shimmied his chest over the sill. He was halfway in, dangling his legs outside, when disaster struck. The vibration of his struggle was the final straw for the ancient sash cord on the right side. Snap. The cord broke. The heavy window, weighing about 40 pounds and lined with double-pane glass, lost its support and slammed down like a guillotine. It didn't hit his neck. It landed square in the center of his back, right below the shoulder blades. The impact drove his chest hard into the wooden sill. Walter gasped in pain, but his muscles, turned to jelly by the massive amount of alcohol, failed to respond. A sober man might have had the explosive strength to bench press the frame off his back, but Walter's motor cortex was offline, and he simply couldn't coordinate his arms to generate the necessary leverage. The weight of the window was pinning his chest to the sill, restricting the movement of his diaphragm. He could exhale, pushing air out, but he couldn't expand his chest to take a breath in. This is called positional asphyxia. It's a slow, silent, and terrifying way to die. Walter kicked his legs, trying to find purchase on the slick siding of the house, but it was useless. He hung there, half in and half out of his own warm home, watching the lights of his Christmas tree twinkle in the living room, just a few feet away, while his vision slowly faded to black. He was found the next morning by the paperboy, looking for all the world like a burglar who had decided to take a nap mid-heist, proving that sometimes the best security system is just a total lack of maintenance and a surplus of bad luck. Today is not a tutorial, it's a warning label. We're running through 10 of the dumbest Christmas deaths ever, real people, real disasters, to show exactly how fast festive turns fatal when booze, ego, and holiday props team up. Laugh, learn, and absolutely do not copy any of this. 1. The human Christmas tree. Let's set the scene. It's December 24th, 11:45 p.m., a time when the collective IQ of the human race takes a nosedive in favor of liquid courage, and we find ourselves in the damp, unfinished basement of a fraternity house in Ohio that smelled entirely of stale beer and bad life choices. This was the natural habitat of Gary, a 22-year-old legend, whose confidence was so high it practically needed its own zip code, while his understanding of electrical engineering was roughly equivalent to that of a golden retriever. Gary was the kind of guy who looked at a high-voltage warning sign and saw it as a challenge to his masculinity rather than a threat to his existence. On this particular festive evening, Gary had decided that the party was lacking a certain je ne sais quoi, and that the solution was to turn himself into the main attraction. His plan? To become the world's first living, breathing, self-powered Christmas tree. Now, if Gary had used modern battery-operated LED fairy lights, the kind that are cool to the touch and operate on the same voltage as a TV remote, he might have survived with nothing more than a bruised ego and some questionable photos on Instagram. But Gary was a purist. He went digging in the garage and unearthed a tangled nest of vintage 1980s outdoor Christmas lights, the big, thumb-sized incandescent bulbs that heat up like miniature reactor cores and draw enough current to dim the lights in the entire neighborhood. These were 220-volt heavy-duty exterior strings, with insulation so old and frayed it looked like it had been chewed on by a colony of meth-addicted rats. With the help of his friends, who, it must be noted, are accessories to stupidity if not legally liable, Gary stripped off his shirt, revealing a torso that was about to become a conducting experiment. They wrapped the heavy, prickly wires tightly around his bare chest, back, and arms, securing the death trap with layer upon layer of silver duct tape. Here is where the biology lesson kicks in, a lesson Gary definitely skipped. The basement was sweltering, the adrenaline was pumping, and Gary was encased in plastic tape and hot glass. Naturally, he began to sweat profusely. Pure water is an insulator, but human sweat is salty, mineral-rich, and essentially nature's favorite electrolyte. Gary had effectively turned his skin into a highly conductive, wet wetsuit, priming his body to become the path of least resistance. As the crowd chanted, "Light him up," feeding the ego that would ultimately kill him, Gary grabbed the plug. He didn't hesitate. He didn't pause to think, "Hey, maybe mixing exposed mains voltage with saline solution on my chest is a bad idea." "No," he shouted. "Merry Christmas, you filthy animals," and jammed the plug into the wall socket with the enthusiasm of a man signing his own death warrant. The result was less festive glow and more electric chair. The 220 volts didn't just illuminate the bulbs. The current found the fraying wires, jumped into his sweat-soaked skin, and surged directly across his chest cavity. The human Christmas tree lit up for exactly 0.4 seconds before the massive electrical discharge seized every muscle in his torso and stopped his heart with the precision of a sniper. He didn't even have time to scream. He just went rigid, vibrating at 60 hertz before collapsing in a heap of sparks, smoke, and the smell of ozone. The breaker eventually tripped, but gravity and cardiac arrest had already done their work. In the end, Gary achieved his goal of being the brightest light in the room, but he paid for the illumination with a one-way ticket to the morgue, leaving the police to file the most ridiculous accident report of the year under death by decoration. 2. The chimney infiltration. We are all fed the childhood propaganda that a morbidly obese man in a velvet suit can magically compress his skeletal structure to slide down millions of chimneys in a single night, delivering joy without suffering a single abrasion. Most of us grow up, learn about physics, and realize this is impossible. Then there was Kevin, a 28-year-old romantic from Oregon whose grip on reality was looser than the belt of the Santa he idolized. Kevin wanted to propose to his girlfriend in the most spectacular way possible, and somewhere in the festive short-circuiting of his brain, he decided that walking through the front door like a normal human being was simply too boring. No, Kevin decided he would execute a Santa Claus entry, descending through the chimney of her 1920s craftsman bungalow to emerge from the hearth, ring in hand, soot on his cheeks, like a chimney sweep Prince Charming. It was a plan that ignored every single tenet of architecture and biology. Kevin waited until 3 a.m., climbed onto the icy roof with the stealth of a ninja who had forgotten to take his medication, and peered into the abyss. Now, let's have a quick lesson on chimney anatomy. They are not smooth, lubricated slides designed for human transport. They are rough, jagged exhaust pipes designed for smoke, and critically, they taper. They get narrower as they go down to improve the draft. Kevin, a man of average build and below-average foresight, sat on the edge of the flue, took a deep breath, and hopped in feet first. The first few feet were deceptively easy, gravity doing its work as he scraped past the initial masonry. But then, geometry decided to intervene. As the chimney narrowed toward the smoke shelf, Kevin's descent came to an abrupt, grinding, bone-crunching halt. He didn't just get stuck, he got wedged. His hips passed a point of no return, but his ribcage caught on the narrowing brickwork, pinning his arms above his head in a posture of permanent surrender. He was now suspended in the dark, cold throat of the house, like a cork in a wine bottle that pushes in but won't pull out. Panic, the great enemy of survival, set in immediately. Kevin tried to exhale to squeeze lower, a fatal mistake. When he exhaled, his chest volume decreased, allowing him to slip a fraction of an inch deeper into the wedge. But when he tried to inhale again, the unyielding bricks wouldn't let his ribs expand. This is a horrifying mechanism known as positional asphyxia. Every breath out was a one-way ticket to a tighter squeeze, and every attempt to breathe in was met with a wall of stone. It was a slow, silent vice. Downstairs, his girlfriend was sleeping soundly, completely unaware that her future fiancé was currently dying in her wall. He couldn't scream because he couldn't get enough air to vibrate his vocal cords. He could only make soft, scraping sounds that she likely mistook for a branch on the roof or a settling foundation. Kevin spent his final moments in total darkness, smelling of old soot and regret, realizing too late that the Santa myth omits the part about cartilage compressibility. He was found the next morning not by his girlfriend but by the fire department, who had to dismantle the entire chimney brick by brick to retrieve him. A grim demolition project that left a pile of rubble in the living room where he had planned to kneel. Kevin wanted to make an entrance she would never forget. And to be fair, he succeeded. She will certainly never forget the time her boyfriend destroyed her fireplace and traumatized the entire neighborhood. 3. The frozen turkey bomb. The culinary world is filled with dangerous tools, mandolins that crave fingertips, pressure cookers that can become shrapnel grenades. But there is no weapon in the suburban arsenal quite as volatile, quite as unforgiving as the turkey deep fryer. It is a device that demands respect, patience, and a PhD in thermodynamics. 3 things that our protagonist, a 45-year-old father named Brad, completely lacked. Brad was the neighborhood know-it-all, the kind of guy who threw instruction manuals into the trash with a scoff, believing that his dad instincts were superior to the warnings of safety engineers. It was a bitterly cold Christmas afternoon, with temperatures dropping well below freezing, and the wind was howling, threatening to extinguish the flame of his propane burner. A sensible man would have moved the operation to a sheltered patio or built a windbreak. Brad, however, decided to innovate. He dragged the entire setup, the propane tank, the open flame burner, and the pot containing 5 gallons of peanut oil, inside his garage. He closed the garage door to keep the heat in, creating a confined space with poor ventilation. That was fatal error number 1. But Brad was just getting started. The centerpiece of this disaster was the turkey itself. Brad had forgotten to take the bird out of the deep freeze 3 days prior, and staring at the rock-hard 20-pound sphere of poultry ice, he made a calculation that would be his last. Oil gets hot, he reasoned. Ice melts. It'll just cook faster. He was about to test the volatility of phase transition in a way that weapon designers would appreciate. He fired up the burner, bringing the oil to a rolling, bubbling 375 degrees Fahrenheit. Then, he grabbed the frozen turkey by the plastic hook and lowered it. Let's pause for the science. When ice touches 375-degree oil, it doesn't just melt, it sublimates, turning instantly into steam and expanding 700 times in volume. This creates a violent, pressurized explosion of gas from beneath the surface. As Brad dropped the icy bird into the pot, the reaction was immediate. The rapidly expanding steam displaced the oil, sending a geyser of superheated grease erupting over the sides of the pot. Gravity took the oil straight down onto the open flame of the propane burner. The result was not a cooking process, but a fuel air bomb. A massive pillar of fire erupted from the pot, instantly igniting the oil-soaked floor, the walls, and the ceiling of the garage. Because the door was closed, the pressure had nowhere to go but through Brad. He was engulfed in a fireball that rivaled a napalm strike, trapped in a garage that had instantly become a blast furnace. The explosion blew the garage door off its tracks and shook the neighbors' windows, signaling to the entire block that Brad's turkey was done. Firefighters later marveled at the sheer efficiency of the destruction. By sealing himself in with the explosive elements, Brad had created a perfect oven, just not for the turkey. He left behind a charred crater and a very important lesson for the neighborhood. Water and hot oil are enemies, but stupidity and high explosives are best friends. Brad wanted a crispy skin on his bird, but he ended up deep frying the entire architectural structure of his home, taking himself out in a blaze of greasy, preventable glory. 4. The rocket sled. If Sir Isaac Newton were alive today, he would likely look at our next candidate, grab a stiff drink, and retire from physics entirely. Because Travis, a 26-year-old adrenaline junkie from Vermont, treated Newton's laws not as rules, but as optional guidelines for the boring. It was late on Christmas Eve, the kind of silent, snowy night that inspires poetry in some and fatal stupidity in others. Travis was bored. The local sledding hill, a steep, icy chute usually populated by toddlers in snowsuits, was deserted. Travis looked at his plastic saucer sled, a $10 disc of injection-molded polyethylene designed for gentle glides, and decided it lacked torque. He didn't want a sled ride. He wanted a re-entry vehicle. Travis was the kind of guy who watched Wile E. Coyote strap a rocket to his back and thought, the concept is sound, the execution was just poor. So he retreated to his garage, the laboratory of bad ideas, and retrieved his secret stash, a box of professional-grade mortar fireworks. These weren't your garden variety sparklers. These were heavy-duty, solid-fuel charges designed to launch explosive shells hundreds of feet into the air. Travis, employing the engineering prowess of a caffeinated squirrel, used an entire roll of silver duct tape to strap 6 of these mortars to the back of his plastic saucer. Now, let's pause for a critical physics lesson that Travis missed. Rockets require stabilization fins, a center of gravity, and a steering mechanism. A round plastic saucer has none of these things. It is designed to spin. Travis had essentially built a pinwheel of death. He hauled his infernal machine to the top of Dead Man's Drop, a hill that terminated not in a soft powder field, but at the edge of a dense, unforgiving forest of ancient oaks. He sat in the saucer, wearing a bicycle helmet that offered about as much protection as a Thoughts and Prayers Facebook post, and lit the fuses. He had about 3 seconds to reconsider his life choices. He didn't. When the mortars ignited, the result was not the smooth acceleration of a Tesla. It was the violent, concussive kick of a mule. The sled didn't slide, it vanished. Travis was launched from a standstill to holy crap velocity in under 2 seconds. The thrust was uneven, and because the sled had no rudder, it immediately began to rotate. Travis was no longer steering. He was the meat in a human centrifuge, spinning at 400 RPM while rocketing down an ice sheet at highway speeds. He couldn't see, he couldn't breathe, and he certainly couldn't steer. The smoke from the rockets blinded him, creating a whiteout of his own making. At the bottom of the hill, a 100-year-old oak tree stood its ground. It had survived lightning strikes, blizzards, and pests, but it was about to meet Travis. The collision was mathematically perfect. The sled, acting as a missile, slammed into the trunk with the kinetic energy of a small hatchback. The plastic shattered into shrapnel, the remaining fireworks exploded on impact, and Travis was instantly stopped by the immovable bark. The police report later described the scene as a pyrotechnic forestry incident, noting that while Travis wanted to break the land speed record for plastic saucers, he only succeeded in becoming the world's fastest tree ornament. He died doing what he loved, ignoring friction and accelerating towards a solid object. 5. The Tower of Terror. Laziness is often hailed as the mother of invention, but in the case of Arthur, a 34-year-old accountant with a hatred for manual labor, it was the mother of a broken neck. Arthur lived in a stunning suburban home featuring a great room with 20-foot cathedral ceilings, an architectural feature that looks majestic in photos, but becomes a nightmare when you need to change a light bulb or, in this case, hang a festive sprig of mistletoe. It was Christmas morning, guests were arriving in an hour, and Arthur realized the chandelier was bare. He wanted to hang the mistletoe to facilitate some romantic ambushes, but there was a problem. The 12-foot extension ladder was in the detached garage. The garage was 50 feet away. It was cold outside. Arthur, wearing his fuzzy slippers and a robe, did a quick risk-benefit analysis and decided that walking 50 feet was simply too much to ask of a human being. He decided to innovate using the Jenga principle of structural engineering. He looked at his dining room table, a sturdy mahogany piece, and dragged it to the center of the room. Base established, he likely thought, feeling smug. But it wasn't high enough. So, he grabbed a solid oak dining chair and placed it on top of the table. Still not high enough. Driven by a fatal cocktail of determination and impatience, he looked around for elevation and spotted his wife's collection of vintage encyclopedias. He grabbed a stack of them, ironically including Volume G for gravity and Volume F for fracture, and piled them onto the seat of the chair. Now, let's examine the physics of this death trap. We have a stack of slippery, glossy books sitting on a hard wooden chair, sitting on a wooden table, which was resting on a decorative Persian rug. And underneath that rug, a highly polished, freshly waxed hardwood floor that had the friction coefficient of a hockey rink. It was a frictionless sandwich of doom. Arthur climbed his precarious Tower of Babel, mistletoe in hand, looking like a low-budget circus act. He stood on the books, wobbling like a drunk flamingo, and reached up toward the chandelier. He was inches away. He stretched. And that tiny shift in his center of mass was the signal physics was waiting for. The chair legs shifted on the table, transferring lateral force to the table legs, which pushed against the rug. The rug, having absolutely zero grip on the waxed floor, decided to go for a slide. It was the classic pulling the tablecloth trick, but Arthur was the dishes. The base of his tower shot out from under him with lightning speed. Arthur didn't just fall, he was launched horizontally before gravity reclaimed him. He plummeted 12 feet, rotating in the air, and missed the soft rug entirely. Instead, he crashed neck first onto the raised brick hearth of the fireplace. The snap was audible in the kitchen. He was found minutes later by his wife, lying amidst scattered knowledge and shattered furniture, the mistletoe lying mockingly on his chest. He died trying to hang a plant that symbolizes love, killed by a floor that symbolized a lack of traction. The coroner ruled it accidental, but we all know the truth. Arthur was murdered by his own refusal to put on shoes and walk to the garage. 6. The indoor lumberjack. There is a specific, dangerous form of stubbornness found in suburban fathers who refuse to admit they made a mistake. And this trait was the defining characteristic of Bill, a 45-year-old project manager whose project management skills evidently did not extend to holiday planning. Bill had gone to a cut-your-own-tree farm and, succumbing to a complete lack of spatial awareness, chopped down a 14-foot Douglas fir for his home, which possessed standard 8-foot ceilings. After wrestling the beast through the front door, knocking over a lamp, and covering the foyer in needles, he hoisted it up. The result was comedic. The top 6 feet of the tree smashed against the ceiling, bending over like a depressed wizard's hat. His wife, the voice of reason in this partnership, suggested the logical solution. Take it back outside and saw the trunk off. Bill, however, was already in his flannel pajamas, nursing a scotch and watching football. "I'm not dragging this thing back out into the snow," he declared, his eyes gleaming with a terrible, lazy idea. "I'll just trim the top right here." He marched to the garage and returned not with a handsaw, but with his gas-powered 18-inch chainsaw, a tool designed for felling timber in open forests, not for cosmetic pruning next to the drapes. He placed a wobbly kitchen stool next to the tree. Let's assess the hazard profile. We have a running 2-stroke combustion engine in a closed living room, a man in slippery cotton socks standing on a stool, and a spinning chain of razor-sharp teeth inches from the drywall. Bill yanked the starter cord. The chainsaw roared to life, filling the cozy living room with the deafening sound of 110 decibels and a thick cloud of blue exhaust smoke. The smell of unburnt hydrocarbons instantly overpowered the scent of pine. Bill climbed the stool, revving the engine like he was auditioning for a horror movie remake. He reached up, holding the heavy saw above his head, a violation of every safety manual ever written, to slice the bent treetop. 2 things happened simultaneously. First, the exhaust fumes venting directly into his face in the stagnant indoor air gave him an immediate hit of carbon monoxide dizziness. Second, as the saw bit into the springy bent wood, it kicked back. The tip of the bar hit a knot, and the laws of physics dictated that the saw must rotate violently upward and backward. The torque threw the dizzy Bill off balance. His sock-clad foot slipped on the smooth wooden stool. He fell backward, but his grip on the throttle tightened in a panic reflex. The chainsaw, still screaming at full RPM, followed gravity down with him. It didn't land on the floor, it landed on Bill, specifically across his neck and collarbone. The mess was instant and catastrophic. The tree stood tall and partially trimmed, a silent witness to the carnage, while Bill lay on the carpet, having successfully removed himself from the census, rather than the tree tip. He wanted the perfect tree without the effort, and he ended up as a cautionary tale about why internal combustion engines and interior decorating are mutually exclusive concepts. 7. The real-life Rudolph. There is a very specific, very dangerous delusion that afflicts urban dwellers when they enter the wilderness. A condition I like to call the Disney Princess Syndrome, where otherwise rational adults convince themselves that wild animals are just fuzzy, unpaid actors waiting for a hug. This brings us to Dylan, a 29-year-old marketing executive from Chicago, whose understanding of zoology was derived entirely from watching cartoons where bears sing jazz. Dylan was attending a high-end winter retreat in the Rocky Mountains, and on Christmas Eve, he had consumed a quantity of spiked eggnog that would have anesthetized a Clydesdale. Around midnight, Dylan looked out the cabin window and spotted a massive bull elk standing at the edge of the forest, breath steaming in the moonlight. Now, a sober person, or anyone with a survival instinct stronger than a moth's, sees a 700-pound beast with spear-tipped bone chandeliers growing out of its head and thinks, "I should lock the door." Dylan, however, saw a content creation opportunity that would make him a legend on TikTok. He turned to his equally intoxicated friends and slurred the famous last words of the suburban idiot. "Watch this, I'm gonna make him Rudolph." He grabbed a red foam clown nose from a pile of party favors and stumbled out into the freezing night, wearing only a hideous Santa's Little Helper sweater and designer jeans. His friends, acting as the grim documentation crew, pulled out their phones and cheered him on from the safety of the porch. Dylan approached the elk, cooing at it with the same tone one would use for a golden retriever puppy. "Here, boy, hold still. Daddy's got a nose for you," he whispered, extending the red foam ball toward the animal's snout. Let's pause for a biology reality check. Bull elk in winter are testosterone-fueled tanks. They are hungry, irritable, and territorially aggressive. They do not know who Santa is, and they certainly do not want to be cosplayed. As Dylan got within arm's reach, invading the animal's personal space with the confidence of a drunk toddler, the elk decided it had had enough of this festive harassment. It didn't run away, it engaged. The elk reared up on its hind legs, towering over Dylan like a hairy skyscraper. Its front hooves, which are essentially sledgehammers made of keratin, flashed in the moonlight. Dylan, whose reaction time was currently lagging by about 3 seconds, didn't even have time to drop the clown nose. The first blow caught him square in the chest, shattering his ribs with the acoustic crunch of stepping on a bag of tortilla chips. The force threw him back into a snowbank, but the elk, viewing the red sweater as a challenge, wasn't done. It proceeded to trample him with a thoroughness that was almost professional, treating Dylan not as a human, but as a predator that needed to be neutralized. By the time his friends stopped laughing and realized that the screaming wasn't part of the joke, the elk had finished its work and trotted off into the darkness, unadorned. Dylan was left as a flat red stain in the driveway, a grim reminder that nature doesn't care about your Instagram following. He wanted to bring a fairy tale to life, but he forgot that in the original fairy tales, people usually get stomped by woodland creatures. He died of massive blunt force trauma, proving that while you can lead a human to nature, you can't make him think. 8. The chimney. Cleaner. Home maintenance is a drag, especially during the holidays when the pressure to have a perfect home turns average men into desperate corner-cutting maniacs. Enter Jerry, a 50-year-old DIY enthusiast whose toolkit consisted entirely of duct tape, WD-40, and unearned confidence. It was 2 hours before his annual Christmas Eve bash, and Jerry faced a crisis. His fireplace was hopelessly clogged with years of accumulated soot. Every time he tried to light a fire, smoke backed up into the living room, threatening to ruin the ambiance. A normal, rational human being would call a chimney sweep or perhaps buy one of those chemical cleaning logs. Jerry, however, was a man of action, a man who believed that any problem could be solved with enough force. He remembered a trick his grandfather allegedly used back in the old country to blast soot out of a chimney. Without verifying the safety, physics, or even the reality of this memory, Jerry went to his reloading bench in the garage. He took a canister of black powder, the kind used for antique muskets, and poured a generous pile into a paper lunch bag. A little boom to shake it loose, he reasoned to himself, feeling like a genius. But Jerry wasn't satisfied with just powder. He wanted to ensure ignition. So, in a move that would make a bomb squad technician weep, he added a cup of gasoline to the bag. He had essentially built a high-yield improvised explosive device, IED, in his living room. He placed the soaking wet bag of death in the fireplace, lit a long fuse, and stepped back, about 3 feet. He expected a whoosh that would push the soot up and out into the night sky. Physics, however, had a different plan. When the powder and gas ignited, they created a massive, instantaneous expansion of hot gas. Now, because the chimney was clogged, which was the whole reason for this exercise, the gas couldn't go up. It was a plugged pipe. The pressure had to go somewhere, and it chose the path of least resistance, out into the room. The explosion was deafening, a sonic boom trapped in a 12x12 living room. The blast wave didn't just blow smoke, it blew the entire heavy brick facade of the fireplace outward. A wall of masonry, weighing several hundred pounds, was launched horizontally at Jerry like an oversized shotgun blast. He was standing right there, drink in hand, wearing a smug grin that was instantly erased by a flying wall of bricks. The force of the blast crushed him instantly against his coffee table, burying him under a pile of rubble, soot, and his own bad decisions. The guests arrived an hour later to find the front door unlocked, the house filled with smoke, and Jerry nowhere to be found, until they noticed the boots sticking out from under the demolished hearth. The coroner's report listed the cause of death as blunt force trauma due to structural stupidity. Jerry wanted a roaring fire. He got a bomb. He cleared the chimney all right, by removing it from the house entirely, along with his own place in the gene pool. 9. The icicle guillotine. There is something strangely mesmerizing about a giant icicle. It glimmers in the sun, a beautiful crystalline dagger of nature. Most people admire them from a distance, or, if they are worried about safety, knock them down from a window. Then there was Frank. Frank was a 38-year-old suburban perfectionist, the kind of guy who measured his lawn grass with a ruler. He was hanging Christmas lights on his eaves when he spotted the big one, a massive 6-foot-long shard of ice hanging directly over the front porch. It was thick as a tree trunk, sharp as a spear, and it offended Frank's sense of symmetry. It had to go. Now, the intelligent way to remove a 50-pound ice spear is to stand to the side and hit it, or perhaps throw a basketball at it from the lawn. Frank, however, was not a student of geometry or basic survival tactics. He stood on his porch directly underneath the behemoth, looking straight up at it like a turkey staring at rain. He armed himself with a push broom, holding it like a jouster. "I'll just give it a little tap and catch it," he perhaps thought, vastly overestimating his own reflexes and underestimating the weight of water. He raised the broom handle straight up, poking at the base of the ice where it met the gutter. He jostled it. Nothing. He poked harder. Still nothing. Frustrated by the ice's stubbornness, Frank gave a mighty, two-handed thrust upward, putting his full back into it. The vibration was enough. The bond broke. The icicle, weighing as much as a large dog but shaped like a medieval javelin, detached instantly. Gravity, which is remarkably consistent, takes about 1 second to accelerate an object 16 feet. Frank didn't even have time to blink. He was looking up, mouth open, broom in hand, when the ice came down. The tip of the icicle caught him squarely in the chest, piercing his sternum and heart with the ease of a hot knife through butter. But the insult didn't stop there. The sheer weight of the ice crushed him to the deck, pinning him like a biological specimen in a display case. He was found 20 minutes later by his wife, who came out to ask why the lights weren't up yet, only to discover Frank pinned to the porch by a melting murder weapon. By the time the paramedics arrived, the evidence was slowly turning into a puddle of water, washing away the scene of the crime. Frank had been killed by the weather, aided and abetted by his own disastrous positioning. It was a freak accident, sure, but one that required a special kind of lack of situational awareness to achieve. He fought the ice, and the ice won, delivering a cold, hard lesson on why you never stand directly under a falling object, especially when you are the one actively poking it with a stick. 10. The gift-wrapped suffocation. We end our festive list with a story of love, dedication, and a complete misunderstanding of mammalian respiratory biology. Meet Steve, a 25-year-old prankster who loved big reveals and hated subtlety. For his first Christmas with his live-in girlfriend, he decided to give her the ultimate gift, himself. But Steve wasn't just going to jump out from behind the sofa like a common amateur. No. He obtained a massive refrigerator box, wrapped it beautifully in shiny red paper, and placed it under the tree. His plan was to hide inside the box, wait for her to come home, and then burst out shouting, "Surprise!" It sounds cute in a romantic comedy. In reality, it was a death trap. Steve climbed into the box at 4:40 p.m. knowing she would be home by 5 on. To ensure the surprise wasn't ruined by a loose flap, he taped the box shut from the inside using heavy-duty industrial packing tape. He did a thorough job, sealing every seam and corner to make the box look like a perfect solid cube. He sat in the dark, giggling to himself, waiting for the front door to open. But 5:00 p.m. came and went. His girlfriend got stuck in gridlock holiday traffic. Then she stopped for groceries. Then she stopped for gas. Steve, cozy in his box, started to feel drowsy. He didn't realize that in his zeal to seal the box, he had created a nearly airtight chamber. Cardboard is porous, but layers of glossy wrapping paper and industrial tape are not. He was slowly consuming the limited oxygen in the box and replacing it with carbon dioxide. This wasn't a nap. It was carbon dioxide narcosis. The CO2 levels rose, lulling him into a deeper, unshakable sleep, suppressing his urge to breathe. By the time his girlfriend walked in the door at 6:45 p.m., Steve wasn't waiting. He was gone. She saw the giant gift, squealed with delight, and, thinking it was a piece of furniture, decided to leave the big one for last. She made dinner, watched a Christmas movie, and finally, around 9:30 p.m., approached the box. She tore off the paper, expecting a new armchair. Instead, she cut the tape to find her boyfriend curled up in the fetal position, blue, cold, and unresponsive. He had suffocated in a box of his own making, killed by his commitment to the bit. The police had to photograph the scene. A grown man dead inside a cardboard coffin wrapped in Happy Holidays paper. It was a tragic, silent end to a prank that required just one air hole to be successful. Steve proved that it is indeed the thought that counts, but unfortunately, he forgot to think about the fact that human beings need oxygen to survive. He gave his life for a punchline that no one ever got to hear, leaving his girlfriend with a traumatic memory that no return policy can ever fix. Be honest. Which of these 10 deaths is uncomfortably close to something you or your family has actually tried? Drop the number, tell the story, and I'll pin the most insane one. Smash like, hit subscribe, and remember, your job is to watch Darwin Awards, not audition for them. We dug up 10 fresh reminders why the holidays are basically a full-contact sport disguised as family time. This isn't a festive countdown. It's a highlight reel of ego colliding with physics at interstate speeds. From roof-skiing dads to I got this electricians, we're here to prove that holiday spirit often comes with a user error clause. Buckle up. Physics is about to file a complaint. 1. The Griswold roof jump. There is a specific, dangerous hallucinogen that permeates the suburban water supply around late December, causing middle-aged fathers to look at their asphalt-shingled roofs and think, yes, that is definitely a ski slope. This brings us to the tragic but predictable saga of Derek, a 42-year-old regional sales manager from Denver who had watched the movie Christmas Vacation one too many times and mistook it for a documentary. Derek was the kind of guy who still bragged about a Black Diamond run he completed in 1998. And on this particular Christmas Eve, fueled by a dangerous cocktail of nostalgia, eggnog, and peppermint schnapps, he decided to become a local legend. His plan was simple, bold, and mathematically illiterate. He would climb out of the second-story bathroom window, click into his old racing skis on the snowy roof, shred down the 30-degree pitch of the shingles, launch off the rain gutter, and land gracefully in the 4-foot snowbank he had piled up on the front lawn. In his mind, it was an X Games highlight reel that would secure his dominance over the neighbors. In reality, it was a physics experiment about friction coefficients that was about to go horribly wrong. Derek spent 20 minutes awkwardly maneuvering his 190 cm skis through the bathroom window, knocking over his wife's expensive lotions and scratching the vinyl siding, which should have been the universe's way of saying stop. But Derek was committed. He stood at the peak of the roof, looking down at the dark windows of his neighborhood, imagining their applause. Now, let's talk about the science of the slide. Roof shingles, even when covered in snow, are not groomed powder runs. They are gritty, sandpaper-like surfaces. However, Derek, in a stroke of fatal genius, had waxed his skis with a high-performance fluorocarbon blend meant for Olympic racing. When he pushed off, he didn't glide. He accelerated with the terrifying speed of a falling anvil. He hit the transition point at the gutter doing about 35 miles per hour. Here is where the calculation failed. Derek had estimated his trajectory based on a gentle toss. He had not accounted for the velocity generated by gravity on a steep incline. He didn't just reach the snowbank, he cleared it. He cleared the snowbank, he cleared the sidewalk, and he cleared the front hedge. Derek sailed through the crisp Christmas air like a majestic flannel-clad eagle, flailing his poles in a desperate attempt to swim through the atmosphere. Gravity, undeniably the harshest mistress of them all, brought him down not in the soft powder, but directly onto the frozen, solid concrete of his driveway. The sound was less whoosh and more crunch. He landed flat on his back, the back of his head meeting the pavement with zero shock absorption. The impact was instant and catastrophic, turning the lights out before his brain even registered that he had missed the landing zone. He was found the next morning by the paperboy, skis still locked to his boots, poles gripped in his cold hands, lying on the driveway like a discarded action figure. The police report noted that while Derek failed to stick the landing, he did succeed in becoming the only man in the county to die of a skiing accident at sea level, proving that while you can buy the gear, you cannot buy a basic understanding of parabolic arcs. 2. The Silent Night. Generator. The holiday season is often synonymous with warmth, light, and noise. But for Barry, a 55-year-old self-proclaimed prepper living in rural Minnesota, this Christmas was destined to be very, very quiet. A massive blizzard had rolled in on Christmas Eve, snapping power lines like twigs and plunging the entire county into icy darkness. Barry, a man who viewed government infrastructure with suspicion and owner's manuals with contempt, was prepared, or so he thought. He had sent his wife and kids to a hotel in the city before the roads closed, leaving him alone to guard the fort and ensure the presents didn't freeze. As the temperature inside the house dropped, Barry decided it was time to unleash his pride and joy, a 5,000-watt industrial gasoline generator. Now, any rational human being knows that combustion engines produce carbon monoxide, a gas that is colorless, odorless, and aggressively homicidal. The warning labels on the machine practically scream, "Do not use indoors," in bold red letters. But Barry looked outside at the howling wind and deep snow and thought, "I'm not running an extension cord through a cracked window. I'm not letting the precious heat out." In a stroke of lazy genius that would seal his fate, Barry dragged the heavy gas-guzzling machine inside, right into the center of his sunken living room. He reasoned that the house was big, the ceilings were high, and he would just crack a window in the kitchen down the hall. He fired up the engine. It roared to life, powering his space heaters, the Christmas tree lights, and crucially, his massive 4K television so he wouldn't miss the holiday football game. Barry settled into his recliner, basking in the warmth and the mechanical roar of the generator, feeling like the smartest man in the apocalypse. What Barry didn't understand is that carbon monoxide bonds to hemoglobin in the blood 200 times stronger than oxygen. It doesn't make you cough, it doesn't make you choke. It just gently turns off the lights in your brain. As the exhaust filled the room, displacing the oxygen, Barry didn't feel suffocated. He just felt pleasantly tired. Must be the stress of the storm, he likely thought, as his eyelids grew heavy. He drifted off into a nap during the second quarter of the game. He never woke up for the halftime show. The generator ran for another 4 hours until the tank went dry, filling the house with a lethal concentration of gas that would have killed a herd of elephants. When his family returned 2 days later after the roads were plowed, they found Barry peaceful in his chair, rosy-cheeked, a classic symptom of CO poisoning, looking for all the world like he was just resting his eyes. The TV was off, the lights were out, and the house was silent, save for the ticking of the cooling engine that had been the guest of honor at Barry's final, lonely party. He had successfully kept the pipes from freezing, but in exchange, he had permanently frozen himself. 3. The Mary Poppins Santa. We all have that one neighbor who treats Christmas decorating not as a festive tradition, but as an arms race to humiliate the rest of the block. Meet Keith, a 30-year-old day trader whose ego was as inflated as the decorations he purchased. Keith had just spent $600 on the crown jewel of his lawn display, a Mega Claus, a towering 20-foot-tall inflatable Santa that required a commercial-grade blower just to stay upright. It was a magnificent nylon monstrosity that dominated the cul-de-sac. However, Christmas Eve brought with it a fierce nor'easter, with wind gusts topping 50 miles per hour. While sensible neighbors were deflating their snowmen and reindeer to prevent damage, Keith watched from his window as his beloved Mega Claus began to strain against its tethers. The plastic stakes pulled loose from the frozen ground, and the giant Santa began to tumble across the lawn like a red and white tumbleweed. Panic set in. Keith wasn't about to let his investment blow into the next county. He grabbed a heavy-duty climbing rope and a carabiner and sprinted out into the storm, wearing nothing but his pajamas and slippers. He caught up to the Santa near the edge of his property, tackled the vinyl fabric, and managed to clip the rope to the heavy D-ring on Santa's belt. But here is where Keith made the decision that would earn him his Darwin Award. Instead of tying the other end of the rope to a tree, a fence post, or a car bumper, Keith, in a moment of adrenaline-fueled stupidity, clipped the carabiner directly to his own heavy leather belt. He essentially tethered himself to a 600-square-foot sail in the middle of a gale. He arrogantly thought his 180 pounds of body weight would act as an anchor. He was wrong. A massive gust of wind, channeled between the two houses, caught the inflatable Santa perfectly. The fabric snapped taut, filling with air instantly. The lift generated was tremendous. Keith didn't even have time to scream. He was yanked off his feet with the violence of a cartoon character, ascending rapidly into the dark sky. For a brief, terrifying moment, Keith was flying, dangling beneath the feet of a smiling plastic Saint Nick, suspended 20 feet in the air like a grotesque ornament. But gravity and turbulence are a chaotic duo. The wind shifted, the sail collapsed slightly, and Keith was dropped not onto the soft lawn but swung violently sideways. He slammed into the neighbor's wrought iron perimeter fence, the kind with the decorative, spear-like finials on top. The impact was gruesome and final. The neighbor found him an hour later, suspended on the fence, with the now deflated Santa draped over him like a shroud. Keith wanted to elevate the neighborhood's holiday spirit, and technically, he did achieve liftoff, but the landing was a dead stop. 4. The aerosol fire starter. There is a special, smoky circle of hell reserved for people who believe that patience is a flaw, and that every problem can be solved with high explosives. And our next candidate, a 35-year-old impatience enthusiast named Kevin, bought a VIP ticket straight to the front row. It was Christmas morning, the family was gathering, and Kevin had one simple masculine job: create a roaring, crackling fire in the hearth to set the perfect festive mood for opening gifts. The problem was that Kevin, a man whose wilderness survival skills were limited to finding the remote control between the sofa cushions, had bought seasoned firewood from a guy in a rusted truck on the side of the highway. As it turns out, the wood was about as dry as a wet sponge at the bottom of the ocean. After 20 minutes of holding a butane lighter to a hissing, steaming log and achieving nothing but a room full of smoke and disappointment, Kevin's patience evaporated. He decided that the fire triangle, heat, fuel, oxygen, was boring and outdated, and what it really needed was a fourth, secret ingredient: chemical propulsion. He marched to the utility closet, bypassed the standard lighter fluid, and grabbed a large, industrial-sized can of aerosol hairspray, or perhaps WD-40. The brand matters less than the stupidity. Now, the warning labels on pressurized aerosol cans are very specific about keeping them away from open flames, usually printed in bold letters for the literacy challenged. But Kevin treated warning labels like terms of service agreements. He scrolled right past them. He knelt before the smoldering hearth, aimed the nozzle at the pathetic little flicker of flame he had managed to coax, and squeezed the trigger. For a split second, it looked like a victory. A satisfying jet of flamethrower-style fire roared to life, engulfing the wet logs. But Kevin, drunk on power and lacking a basic understanding of fluid dynamics, didn't stop. He held the trigger down, trying to force-feed the fire. Here is the physics lesson Kevin missed. When you spray a pressurized aerosol continuously into a fire, the flame doesn't just go out. it can travel back up the stream. The stream of atomized propellant acted as a fuse. The fire raced back up the spray, moving faster than Kevin's synapses could fire the command to release the button, and entered the nozzle. This is a catastrophic phenomenon known as flashback. The flame ignited the volatile mixture inside the can. In a fraction of a second, the metal canister in his hand transformed from a grooming product into a fragmentation grenade. The explosion was deafening, shaking the stockings off the mantel. The bottom of the can blew out, and the thin metal casing shredded. Shrapnel flew everywhere, but gravity and bad luck dictated the worst possible trajectory. A jagged, razor-sharp piece of the aluminum casing sliced directly into Kevin's neck, severing his carotid artery. He collapsed on the hearthrug, right in front of the unlit fire he was so desperate to start. The fire never did catch, but Kevin certainly did. He was found by his family seconds later. A tragic example of why patience is a virtue and why you should never bring a pressurized bomb to a firewood fight. 5. The heavy mantle. Christmas decorating is usually a harmless activity, involving nothing more dangerous than a paper cut, a tangle of lights, or a slight bruised ego. But for Roger, a 40-year-old accountant with a poor grasp of structural engineering and an obsession with aesthetics, it became a lethal physics experiment. Roger lived in a flipped house, a home renovated quickly and cheaply by an investor looking for maximum profit. One of the key selling features was a heavy rustic stone mantelpiece above the fireplace. It looked solid, like something ripped from a medieval castle. In reality, the contractor, cutting corners to save time, had glued the massive stone slab to the drywall with construction adhesive rather than bolting it into the wooden studs. Roger, blissfully unaware of this structural fraud, decided to hang the stockings. But Roger was a perfectionist. He didn't just want to hang empty, limp socks. He wanted them to look full and stretched, like in the glossy pages of a Pottery Barn catalog. He grabbed the oversized, personalized stockings for himself, his wife, and his 3 kids. To weigh them down and give them that stuffed with gifts look before the actual presents arrived, he decided to use what he had on hand: his gym equipment. He placed a 10-pound dumbbell in the toe of each stocking. That's 50 pounds of dead weight hanging off the very front edge of a stone slab that was held up by glue and hope. The leverage, or torque, applied to the adhesive was immense. The mantle held, for now. But Roger wasn't done. He decided the display needed visual balance, so he added a heavy, solid cast-iron nutcracker to the center of the shelf. He stepped back to admire his work, a smug smile on his face, then noticed a stray piece of tinsel on the hearth. He knelt down to pick it up, placing his head and neck directly in the impact zone. That tiny vibration of his footsteps was the final straw for the stressed adhesive. The glue gave way with a sound like a gunshot. The 150-pound stone slab, aided by 50 pounds of iron weights, detached from the wall. It didn't fall straight down. It rotated, tipping forward. Roger, on his knees like an execution victim, never saw it coming. The heavy stone edge struck him squarely on the back of the neck and skull, pinning him to the hearth like a bug. The sound was sickening, a mix of crumbling drywall and breaking bone. He died instantly, crushed by the very festive spirit he was trying to manufacture. His wife found him later, buried under a pile of stone, iron, and red velvet stockings. It was a grim reminder that in the world of home renovation and holiday decor, gravity always bats last, and glue is not a structural fastener. 6. The dry ice cocktail. There is a growing, dangerous trend of amateur mixologists trying to make their holiday parties Instagrammable by using industrial chemicals they don't understand. And this brings us to the tragic tale of Simon, a 28-year-old host who thought chemistry was just cooking with cooler names. Simon wanted his Christmas punch to be the talk of the party. He wanted it to smoke, to bubble, to look like a witch's brew straight out of a Tim Burton movie. So he went to the grocery store and bought 10 pounds of dry ice. For those who slept through high school science class, dry ice is solid carbon dioxide frozen at 78.5 degrees Celsius, 109.3 degrees. It is cold enough to instantly freeze skin and cause severe frostbite on contact. A rational person uses tongs and a protective cage to put dry ice in a drink, ensuring no one ingests the solid. Simon, however, just hammered the block into jagged ice cube-sized chunks and dumped them directly into the punch bowl. He then ladled the smoking, bubbling liquid, chunks and all, into glasses for his guests. "Drink up, it's a fogtail," he cheered. To demonstrate his alpha host status, Simon proposed a toast and chugged his drink. In his enthusiasm, he swallowed a walnut-sized chunk of the solid dry ice. This was fatal error number 1. The ice didn't melt. It stuck. It lodged in his esophagus, just above his stomach. The pain was immediate and excruciating, a thermal burn that felt like swallowing a hot coal, but freezing. But the cold wasn't what killed him. As the dry ice warmed up inside his body, it underwent sublimation, turning directly from a solid to a gas. Carbon dioxide expands over 500 times in volume when it turns to gas. Simon basically had a rapidly inflating bomb inside his chest. He clutched his throat, eyes bulging, unable to speak or breathe as the pressure spiked. His esophagus and upper stomach simply couldn't handle the rapid expansion. Pop. A massive rupture occurred internally, tearing his digestive tract open. Simon collapsed on the kitchen floor, surrounded by festive fog, gasping for air that his body couldn't process because his diaphragm was compressed by the internal gas. The guests thought he was choking on a fruit garnish and tried the Heimlich maneuver, which only compressed the gas-filled cavity further, accelerating the trauma. He died of massive internal hemorrhaging and shock before the ambulance could even start its engine. Simon wanted a killer party trick, and he got one. He proved that while dry ice looks cool, using your stomach as a pressure vessel is a really stupid way to celebrate Christmas. 7. The high voltage star. There is a specific, dangerous form of seasonal madness that infects suburban fathers around mid-December, a competitive compulsion to have not just a Christmas tree, but the Christmas tree, a botanical monument to their own ego that dominates the entire neighborhood. This brings us to the tragic and electrifying saga of Hank, a 45-year-old middle manager who, ironically, died because he forgot the very first rule of home safety. Hank possessed a magnificent 40-foot blue spruce in his front yard, a tree that was the envy of the homeowners association and the pride of his existence. Every year, he lit it up with thousands of bulbs, but this year, he wanted to go bigger. He bought a massive, flashing LED North Star for the very tip, a beacon meant to guide wise men, or at least delivery drivers, to his driveway. The problem? Hank didn't own a 40-foot ladder, and he was far too cheap to rent a cherry picker for the afternoon. He stood on his porch, staring at the tree, then at his backyard swimming pool, and a light bulb went on in his head. Unfortunately, it was the dimmest bulb in his mental chandelier. He grabbed his telescoping aluminum pool skimmer pole, which extended to a wobbly 20 feet. "Not long enough," he muttered to himself. So, he grabbed a second aluminum pole from the garage, duct-taped them together with enough silver adhesive to fix a hole in the International Space Station and attached the star to the end. He now wielded a 40-foot, highly conductive metal spear. It was late Christmas Eve, a wet snow was falling, and Hank marched out to the front yard like a festive gladiator entering the arena. He began to hoist the pole, aiming for the tip of the spruce. Now, here is the environmental hazard Hank ignored in his quest for decorative dominance. Running directly about 4 feet above the tip of his tree were the neighborhood's primary high-voltage distribution lines, carrying 14,400 volts of raw grid power. Hank was looking at the tree, at the star, and at his shoes. He was not looking at the sky. As he wrestled the heavy, unwieldy aluminum pole into position, fighting gravity and the wind, he leaned it back to get better leverage. The tip of the pole didn't even have to touch the wire. It just had to get close. At 14,400 volts, electricity doesn't need a handshake. It can jump a gap through the air. An arc of blue-white plasma, hot enough to melt sand into glass, leapt from the power line to the aluminum pole. Hank, standing in wet snow, wearing soggy leather boots, was the perfect ground connection. The current traveled down the pole at the speed of light. He didn't get shocked. He got processed by physics. The neighbors reported a sound like a cannon shot and a flash that momentarily blinded the entire block. The power for the whole neighborhood went out instantly, plunging Christmas Eve into total darkness. Hank was found, or rather, what was left of his smoking boots was found, still gripping the melted handle of the pool pole. He wanted to be the star of the neighborhood, and for a brief, blinding millisecond, he was technically the brightest object in the county. The coroner's report was a grim lesson in conductivity. Aluminum plus high voltage plus wet snow. A closed casket funeral. Hank died proving that while a man's reach should exceed his grasp, it should definitely not exceed the safety clearance of the municipal power company. 8. The frozen lake shortcut. Patience is generally considered a virtue, but for Brock, a 28-year-old truck enthusiast who defined his entire personality by the size of his lift kit and the loudness of his exhaust, patience was for people who drove hybrids. It was late afternoon on Christmas Eve, and Brock had just cut down the perfect timber-sized tree from a forest patch on the other side of the lake. He was late for his family's dinner, and the main two-lane road around the lake was clogged with holiday traffic and slowpoke tourists looking at lights. Brock looked at his dashboard GPS, which showed a solid line of red traffic, then looked at the frozen expanse of the lake. "It's been freezing for a week," he reasoned, tapping the steering wheel of his 3-ton, heavy-duty diesel pickup truck. "It'll hold. I've got all-terrain tires." This brings us to the concept of bearing capacity. Clear, solid blue ice needs to be at least 12 to 15 inches thick to safely support a medium-duty truck. The ice on Lake Winnipesaukee that day was maybe 6 inches of white, bubble-filled ice. Fine for a snowmobile, suicidal for a tank. Brock put his truck in 4-wheel drive, cranked up Grandma, got run over by a reindeer, and rolled onto the ice. He felt like a genius commercial driver, cutting a 45-minute trip down to 10. He was about halfway across, the shore lights twinkling festively in the distance, when physics decided to audit his decision. He didn't hear a crack. He felt a drop. The ice didn't slowly give way. It shattered under the front axle's immense weight like a pane of glass. The truck, being front-heavy due to the massive diesel engine, did a violent nosedive. In seconds, the hood was underwater, and the windshield was submerged in black, freezing water. Brock panicked. He tried to open the driver's side door. Here is the terrifying reality of sinking vehicles that movies get wrong. Water pressure. Even a few feet of water exerts thousands of pounds of pressure against the door surface. A human being, even one as gym-obsessed as Brock, cannot push it open. The electric system shorted out almost instantly as the water hit the battery, meaning the power windows wouldn't roll down. Brock was trapped in a sinking steel cage. As the truck tilted vertical and began its descent to the muddy bottom, the air pocket inside was his only lifeline, but it was rapidly disappearing. Brock spent his final Christmas Eve realizing that his heated leather seats, custom rims, and Hemi engine were now just heavy anchors in a coffin he had financed at 12% APR. He drowned in the dark, cold silence of the lake, just a mile from the warm dinner waiting for him. The rescue divers found him the next day, still buckled in, a grim reminder that all-terrain tires do not apply to liquid water, and that taking a shortcut across thin ice is actually the fastest route to the afterlife. 9. The samurai gift. There is a specific demographic of adult men who suffer from the delusion that possessing a weapon automatically grants them the skill to use it, a condition often exacerbated by holiday alcohol. Meet Kyle, a 30-year-old software developer who had spent way too much time watching anime and not enough time understanding human biology. On Christmas morning, his brother gave him the gift he had always wanted, a battle-ready replica katana. It was sharp, shiny, and dangerous. By 6 p.m., Kyle was 4 eggnogs and 2 scotches deep, and the boredom of the family gathering had set in. He wanted to demonstrate the blade's cutting power to his horrified family. He didn't have a bamboo mat or a proper cutting stand. He had a watermelon from the fruit basket. In a decision that defies every survival instinct evolved over millions of years, Kyle decided to perform the Fruit Ninja Challenge. He sat on the living room sofa, placed a small decorative throw pillow on his lap, put a wooden cutting board on the pillow, and balanced the watermelon on top. "Watch this," he slurred. eyes glazing over with unearned confidence. I'm gonna slice it clean in half without touching the board. He stood up, unsheathed the sword, and assumed a stance he had learned entirely from a video game. He swung the sword downward with all his might. The steel was high quality. The watermelon offered zero resistance. The blade sliced through the melon like a laser. It sliced through the cutting board. It sliced through the pillow. And because momentum is a real thing that Kyle forgot to calculate, the blade continued its arc directly into Kyle's left thigh. The femoral artery is a major highway for blood, about the width of a finger, operating under high pressure. Kyle severed it completely. The scene went from festive party to a scene from Kill Bill in less than a second. The blood loss was catastrophic and immediate. Kyle looked down, confused that his leg was warm, and then collapsed back onto the sofa. A femoral bleed can cause unconsciousness in 90 seconds and death in minutes. Despite his family's frantic attempts to use a belt as a tourniquet and call 911, the damage was too severe and the cut too deep. Kyle bled out under the Christmas tree, surrounded by torn wrapping paper and a perfectly sliced watermelon. He died proving that a sword is not a toy, and that your own lap is historically the absolute worst possible place to put a chopping block. He wanted to be a samurai, and in a twisted way, he achieved it. He committed accidental seppuku in front of his entire lineage, ruining Christmas forever. 10. The Santa Zipline. We conclude with the saga of Tim, a 42-year-old cool dad who wanted to create the ultimate unforgettable Christmas memory for his kids. A Santa sleigh ride, zipline, running from the roof of the detached garage to the big oak tree in the backyard. Tim was a man who believed that instruction manuals were for cowards and that hardware store rope was basically the same as steel cable. He went to the local bargain bin and bought 100 feet of yellow polypropylene rope, the cheap, plastic kind used for tying down tarps, not for supporting human weight. He also bought a carabiner, but not a climbing-rated one. He bought a 99-cent aluminum keychain clip. He rigged the line, tying knots that looked like pretzels, and called the family out to the freezing backyard to watch. "Daddy's gonna test it out first to show you how Santa flies," he announced, wearing a Santa hat and a grin full of hubris. Tim climbed the ladder to the garage roof, which was about 12 feet off the ground. The destination tree was 60 feet away. He hooked the cheap keychain carabiner onto the yellow plastic rope and grabbed onto a handle he had fashioned from an old broomstick. He jumped. For the first 10 feet, it was glorious. He was flying. But then, physics filed a grievance. The friction of the metal carabiner sliding rapidly against the plastic rope generated intense heat. Polypropylene melts at a relatively low temperature. Simultaneously, the dynamic load of a 200-pound man bouncing on the line exceeded the tensile strength of the cheap rope by a factor of 3. Halfway across the yard, right over the concrete patio, the rope didn't just snap, it melted and shredded. Tim was horizontal in a flying superhero pose when the support vanished. Gravity took over instantly. He rotated in the air and fell 10 feet, landing flat on his back directly onto the edge of the brick planter box. The sound of his spine meeting the masonry was audible over the Christmas carols playing on the porch. He suffered a catastrophic spinal fracture and massive internal trauma. He didn't get up. His kids watched Santa fall from the sky and break into pieces. Tim wanted to be the hero of Christmas morning, but he cheaped out on the materials and ignored the laws of friction. He died right there on the patio, a tragic example of why you don't build life support systems out of materials from the dollar bin. He left his family with a traumatic memory and a very important lesson. If you want to fly, buy a plane ticket or at least use a steel cable. If this episode taught us anything, it's that holiday decorations should come with warning labels, and maybe a user manual written by a physicist. Let me know in the comments which story made you rethink your own festive setup, or which one you're absolutely blaming on holiday magic. Hit subscribe and like, and we'll dig up even more seasonal chaos next time. You thought the gene pool was safe? Think again. We've found 10 festive geniuses who treated Christmas like a full-contact sport and lost hard. From kitchen experiments that turned into indoor fireworks to high-voltage tree disasters, this is proof that holiday spirit supercharges bad ideas. This isn't a cozy countdown. It's a safety briefing with punchlines. Do not attempt any of this unless you're trying to audition for Part 4. 1. The pressure cooker. Ham. The holidays are a time for slow-cooked meals, family bonding, and the occasional catastrophic kitchen explosion caused by pure, unadulterated impatience. Meet Gordon, a 50-year-old amateur chef whose culinary ambition was only matched by his complete lack of understanding regarding high-pressure thermodynamics. It was Christmas Day, 4 p.m., and Gordon was in a full-blown panic. The in-laws, a notoriously judgmental group of people, were arriving in exactly 1 hour, and Gordon had made a fatal error. He had forgotten to put the massive 15-pound holiday ham in the oven that morning. Staring at the raw, cold slab of pork, Gordon decided he didn't need time. He needed physics. He pulled out his grandmother's antique, industrial-sized pressure cooker, a heavy cast aluminum vessel that looked more like a piece of Soviet artillery than a kitchen appliance. Now, the manual for this device, which Gordon had likely used to level a wobbly table leg years ago, clearly states 2 golden rules. Do not fill past the max line, and never under any circumstances force the lid open. Gordon, a man who viewed safety warnings as suggestions for the weak, ignored both. He shoved the giant ham into the pot, barely fitting it in, and filled the remaining microscopic air gaps with water, leaving absolutely zero room for expansion. He cranked the stove to high and waited. Within 20 minutes, the pot was hissing like a furious cobra, rattling against the burner. The pressure gauge was pegged deep in the red zone, vibrating violently. But Gordon, hearing the doorbell ring, made the decision that would end his bloodline. "It's gotta be done," he muttered, grabbing the handle with a towel. He tried to twist the lid. It wouldn't budge, because thousands of pounds of pressurized steam were holding it shut, trying to save his life. A rational man would let it cool. Gordon, however, was a man on a deadline. He grabbed a pry bar from the junk drawer for leverage and used his full body weight to force the locking mechanism. He succeeded. The latch gave way. Instantly, the superheated water inside, which was well above 212 degrees but kept liquid by the pressure, flashed into steam. The expansion ratio of water to steam is 1/1600. In a microsecond, the pot didn't just open, it detonated. The heavy cast aluminum lid blasted upward with the kinetic energy of a cannonball, catching Gordon directly under the chin. The impact was instant and lights out. The ham, now a supersonic projectile, followed the lid, embedding itself in the ceiling drywall with a wet thud. When the in-laws walked in moments later, they found a kitchen destroyed by a pork-based IED and a son-in-law who had been taken out by his own main course. Gordon wanted to save time, and in a way, he did. He skipped straight to the end of his life, leaving behind a very messy kitchen and a cautionary tale about why you never argue with Boyle's Law. 2. The snowblower panic. There is a specific blinding rage that consumes a suburban father when machinery fails him in the freezing cold. And this rage was the undoing of Mark, a 35-year-old accountant who valued punctuality over limb retention. It was Christmas Eve, and a heavy, wet blizzard, the kind meteorologists call heart attack snow, was pounding the suburbs. Mark's extended family was due to arrive for the big holiday party in exactly 10 minutes, but the driveway was buried under 2 feet of sludge. Mark fired up his beastly 2-stage snowblower, a machine designed to chew through ice banks. He was making good progress until, with a sickening thunk, the auger jammed. The wet, sticky snow had compacted into a concrete-like block inside the discharge chute. The engine sputtered but kept running, the belt squealing in protest. Mark stood there, freezing, watching the clock tick down. He knew the safety rule. It was printed in bright yellow stickers all over the machine. Turn off engine before clearing clog. But turning it off meant restarting it, and the pull start was finicky in the cold. "I'll just be quick," Mark thought, a phrase that appears on roughly 40% of all Darwin Award applications. He left the engine roaring. He didn't use the plastic clean-out tool attached to the handle for this exact purpose. No, Mark used the tool God gave him, his right hand. He reached deep into the metal chute to grab the chunk of ice. Here is the mechanical trap he walked into. The auger blades were under immense tension. The engine was trying to turn them, but the ice was holding them back. It was essentially a loaded bear trap. As soon as Mark's fingers dislodged the ice chunk, the stored energy was released instantly. The steel impellers snapped forward with blinding speed and torque. It wasn't a clean cut, it was a grinder. The machine pulled his hand, then his arm, into the mechanism faster than his brain could process the mistake. The shock was immediate. Mark, now inextricably attached to a running snowblower, collapsed onto the driveway. The blood loss was catastrophic, accelerated by the pumping heart of a panicked man in freezing temperatures. By the time his guests pulled up 5 minutes later, festive gifts in hand, they found Mark lying in the red-stained snow, the machine still chugging away, having effectively cleared the driveway of its owner. He wanted to clear a path for his family, but he ended up traumatizing them for life, proving that saving 30 seconds is never worth the price of admission. 3. The Ornament Cannon. We wrap up this trio with the story of Dave, a 42-year-old DIY enthusiast who believed that anything worth doing was worth over-engineering to the point of absurdity. Dave had a 50-foot pine tree in his front yard that he desperately wanted to decorate for Christmas. Ladders were too short, and renting a cherry picker was money down the drain, according to Dave. He looked at his collection of PVC pipes and air compressors and had a eureka moment that should have been a call 911 moment. He built a pneumatic air cannon, essentially a potato gun on steroids, designed to launch bundles of lights over the highest branches. He tested it at 40 psi, and it worked okay, lobbing a tennis ball halfway up the tree. But the lights were heavier, and they weren't going high enough. "More power," Dave grunted, channeling his inner Tim Taylor. He cranked the air compressor up to 120 psi, 3 times the rated safety limit of the cheap Schedule 40 PVC pipe he had bought at the discount hardware store. He loaded a heavy bundle of lights into the barrel, jamming them down to create a tight seal. He rested the breech of the cannon against his shoulder like a bazooka, aiming almost straight up at the treetop, his face pressed against the plastic chamber to aim. He had essentially placed a plastic pipe bomb next to his ear. He pulled the trigger valve. The compressed air rushed into the chamber with incredible force, but the bundle of lights was wedged too tight. It didn't move fast enough to relieve the pressure spike. The PVC pipe, brittle from the freezing winter air, couldn't handle the stress. Instead of launching the lights, the breech of the cannon exploded. Shards of sharp, jagged white plastic flew outward at the speed of sound. Dave took the brunt of the blast directly to the face and neck. A large shard of the pressurized chamber acted like a jagged dagger, severing his jugular instantly. He dropped to the lawn, covered in unstrung Christmas lights and pieces of his failed invention. His wife, watching from the porch, witnessed the loudest and deadliest decoration attempt in neighborhood history. Dave proved that while PVC is great for plumbing, it makes for a terrible firearm, especially when you hold it against your head. He aimed for the stars, but he was taken out by the plumbing aisle, leaving behind a half-decorated tree and a very confused police report. 4. The Drone Mistletoe. The intersection of holiday romance and high-speed aviation is a perilous place where few dare to tread. But our next Darwin Award winner, a 29-year-old tech entrepreneur named Jason, decided to set up camp right in the middle of it. Jason lived in a hyper-modern, open-concept home with a grand, 2-story foyer, a vertical space that was crying out for a festive sprig of mistletoe to encourage holiday smooching. However, Jason viewed ladders as analog tools for peasants and the elderly. He was a man of the future, a disruptor, and he owned a $2,000 professional-grade racing drone with carbon fiber propellers that spun at 30,000 RPM. His brilliant, lazy plan was to attach the mistletoe to the drone's undercarriage and hover it above his guests, creating a dynamic, high-tech, romantic gesture. It was a plan that ignored the fundamental difference between outdoor and indoor flight dynamics. Jason stood in the middle of the crowded foyer, piloting the beast via FPV goggles, while the drone hovered ominously near the ceiling, sounding less like a festive helper and more like a swarm of angry mechanical hornets. Now, here is the technical glitch Jason missed in his hubris. Commercial drones rely heavily on GPS satellites for stability and position holding. Inside a house with thick concrete walls and steel beams, GPS signals are blocked. This forces the drone into attitude mode, where it drifts wildly based on air currents and inertia, requiring constant, expert manual correction. As Jason maneuvered the loud, windy machine closer to the chandelier to position the mistletoe, the drone caught a strong downdraft from the central HVAC vent. It drifted sharply to the left. Jason, panicked and lacking the reflex skills of a pro pilot, overcorrected hard on the controller sticks. The drone, now a flying blender with the cutting power of a weed whacker, pitched forward aggressively. Instead of hitting the chandelier, it dove in a parabolic arc. And where was Jason standing? Directly in the flight path, staring up with his mouth open, mesmerized by his own creation. A racing drone can accelerate from 0 to 60 mph in under a second. It closed the distance instantly. Jason didn't even have time to duck. The carbon fiber blades, which are sharp enough to slice through raw vegetables in YouTube demo videos, met Jason's neck with surgical precision. The impact was gruesome and final. The propellers shattered on contact, but not before delivering multiple deep fatal lacerations to his carotid artery and jugular vein. Jason collapsed on his expensive marble floor, the drone buzzing angrily beside him like a confused, murderous insect. His girlfriend walked in expecting a kiss under the mistletoe and instead found a scene from a sci-fi horror movie. Jason wanted to elevate his holiday game, but he forgot that indoor airspace is a no-fly zone for a reason. He died by the sword, or rather, by the rotor, proving that some traditions like using a cheap plastic stepladder exist because they don't involve accidental decapitation by a robot. 5. The sleigh test pilot. There is a dangerous, undocumented hallucinogen that seems to affect suburban fathers in late December, convincing them that they are essentially professional stunt coordinators and that physics is a negotiable concept. Meet Steve, a 40-year-old dad who watched the movie Elf one too many times and decided his life lacked sufficient whimsy. Steve spent 3 weekends building a replica of Santa's sleigh out of heavy 3-4-inch plywood, 2x4 lumber, and pure, unadulterated optimism. It was a heavy, unaerodynamic box painted festive red with gold trim. His master plan was to launch this wooden behemoth from the peak of his detached garage roof, slide down the asphalt shingles, launch off the eaves, and land safely on the family's 12-foot trampoline in the backyard. In his mind, the trampoline would act as a gentle cushion, bouncing him playfully into a soft pile of snow, creating the ultimate viral Christmas video. In reality, he was setting up a lethal physics experiment involving kinetic energy, trajectory calculation, and material strength. 3 subjects Steve had failed miserably in high school. On Christmas Eve, he dragged the heavy wooden sleigh to the peak of the garage roof, sweating and cursing. He sat inside, wearing a Santa hat and holding a GoPro on a selfie stick to document his triumph. He shouted to his kids, "Merry Christmas to all, and to all a good flight," and pushed off. The wooden runners on the frost-covered asphalt shingles created significantly less friction than he anticipated. The sleigh didn't glide, it plummeted. By the time he hit the edge of the roof, he was moving at a terrifying velocity. Here is where the math failed him. Steve hadn't accounted for the combined mass of the heavy sleigh plus his own 200-pound dad bod. The launch velocity was too high. He didn't just hit the trampoline, he overshot it completely. He soared through the crisp winter air, a look of pure, undiluted terror replacing his festive cheer as he watched the safety net pass harmlessly beneath him. Gravity, the harshest mistress of them all, brought him down not on the bouncy mat, but on the frozen concrete walkway next to it. The impact was sickening and absolute. The plywood sleigh shattered into shrapnel on impact, and Steve's head met the pavement with 0 shock absorption. The GoPro, ironically, survived to record the final, tragic thud and the subsequent silence. Steve was found by his kids, who thought Santa had crashed, only to realize it was just their dad making a terrible life choice. He died of massive blunt force trauma, proving that while reindeer can fly, plywood boxes definitely cannot, and that trampolines are terrible landing pads for unguided missiles. 6. The champagne shatter. Nothing says classy holiday party like sabrage, the Napoleonic art of opening a champagne bottle with a sword. And nothing says festive funeral quite like doing it completely wrong with the wrong tools. Enter Michael, a 35-year-old investment banker who believed that his confidence and tax bracket were substitutes for actual skill. It was New Year's Eve, the grand finale of the holiday season, and Michael wanted to impress his guests with a stunt he had seen once on Instagram. He grabbed a magnum of expensive vintage champagne and, lacking a proper cavalry saber, decided to use a heavy, dull chef's knife he found in the kitchen drawer. Now, sabrage works on a specific physical principle. You strike the glass lip of the bottle at its weakest point, the seam, using the internal pressure to blow the top off cleanly. However, there are strict rules. Rule number 1. The bottle must be ice cold to make the glass brittle and predictable. Michael's bottle had been sitting out on the counter for 2 hours. It was warm. Rule number 2. You slide the blade along the seam gently. Michael just planned to whack it like a piñata. He stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by friends in their finery, clearing a space. He held the warm, highly pressurized bottle in his left hand and the heavy knife in his right. He didn't look at the seam. He just looked at the crowd. He swung. He didn't slide. He chopped. He hit the neck of the warm bottle with the brute force of a lumberjack. Instead of a clean break at the annulus, the structural integrity of the bottle failed catastrophically. The magnum exploded in his hand like a glass grenade. The internal pressure, roughly 90 psi, which is 3 times the pressure of a car tire, blasted shards of thick, green glass outward with lethal velocity. One large, razor-sharp shard was propelled backward by the blast, flying directly into Michael's neck. It severed his jugular vein instantly. The party went from cheers to screams in a heartbeat as arterial spray decorated the hors d'oeuvres. Michael collapsed onto the Persian rug, the expensive champagne mixing with his own blood in a grim cocktail. He died before the ball dropped in Times Square, a victim of his own hubris and a complete lack of thermodynamic knowledge. He wanted to look like a French general, but he ended up looking like a cautionary tale about why corkscrews were invented. He proved that when you fight a pressurized vessel with a blunt object and zero technique, the vessel usually wins. 7. The daisy chain inferno. Electricity is a magical, invisible force that powers our modern lives, but it is also a vengeful, mathematical spirit that absolutely hates stupidity. And our next candidate, 60-year-old Bob, was about to learn this lesson in the hottest way possible. Bob was a stubborn traditionalist who believed that modern LED lights were soulless, too dim, and part of a global conspiracy to ruin Christmas. He insisted on using his vintage collection of C9 incandescent bulbs, those big, thumb-sized painted glass lights from the 1970s that heat up like miniature suns and consume enough wattage to power a small village. Bob wanted his tree to be visible from the International Space Station. He had accumulated 50 strands of these energy hogs over the decades. Now, any first-year electrician or even a person with basic common sense will tell you that you can only safely connect about 3 strands end-to-end before the current flowing through the thin copper wires exceeds their rating. This is called daisy chaining, and doing it to excess is a major fire hazard. Bob, however, viewed circuit limits and safety ratings as government propaganda designed to limit his joy. He plugged all 50 strands into a single, terrifying megachain, creating a continuous loop of resistance that spanned the entire circumference of his massive spruce tree. He then plugged that monstrosity into a single, ungrounded 2-prong outlet in his 1950s-era home, using a cheap plastic adapter. The result was blindingly bright. The tree glowed with the intensity of a nuclear reactor meltdown. Bob was so proud of his work that he decided to sleep in the living room recliner to admire it, basking in the warm, cozy glow. But the warmth wasn't just coming from the bulbs. Inside the walls, the ancient cloth-wrapped copper wiring, which was rated for maybe 15 amps, was currently drawing about 40. It was glowing cherry red, melting its crumbling rubber insulation and turning the dry 70-year-old wooden studs into kindling. While Bob dreamed of sugar plums and high electric bills, his wall cavity turned into a blast furnace. The fire didn't start on the tree. It started inside the wall behind the outlet, creeping up the studs silently. By the time the smoke detectors finally screamed, the room was already filled with thick, toxic black smoke from burning plastic and drywall. Carbon monoxide, the silent killer of the holidays, lulled Bob into a deeper sleep before the flames even reached him. He didn't cough. He didn't wake up. He simply transitioned from a nap to an eternal slumber, surrounded by the lights he loved so much. The fire department later noted that the single outlet had fused into an unrecognizable lump of molten plastic and copper, a monument to Bob's refusal to understand Ohm's law. He wanted the brightest house on the block, and for a few hours, as the flames engulfed the roof and illuminated the night sky, he certainly achieved it. 8. The blind tree driver. There is a special dangerous breed of optimism found in men who drive compact sedans but buy cathedral-sized Christmas trees, believing that willpower is a substitute for cargo capacity. Meet Ted, a 30-year-old Honda Civic owner who refused to pay the $20 delivery fee on principle. Ted went to the local tree lot and picked out a magnificent 12-foot Douglas fir. It was a beast of a tree, wider than his car and twice as long. The lot attendant, seeing Ted's tiny vehicle, offered to tie it down with professional twine or arrange delivery, but Ted scoffed. "I got it," he said, pulling out a handful of old, stretched-out bungee cords from his trunk, the kind that have lost all their elasticity and are basically just loose ropes with hooks. He laid the massive tree on the roof of his sedan. Fatal mistake. Number 1. He placed it root end forward, meaning the wind would catch the branches like a parachute. Fatal mistake. Number 2. He secured it only with the elastic cords, hooking them to the plastic rain guards. A bungee cord allows for movement. It stretches. Ted had essentially created a giant, loaded slingshot on his roof. He drove off, the tree bouncing ominously with every pothole. He merged onto the highway, hitting 65 miles per hour. The wind resistance on a tree that size at highway speeds is immense. Hundreds of pounds of force pushing backward. It pushed against the branches, stretching the weak bungee cords to their absolute limit. Then, traffic ahead suddenly slowed. Ted slammed on the brakes. Physics took the wheel. The car stopped, but the tree, possessing significant momentum and held only by rubber bands, did not. The tree shot forward with violent force. The root ball slid down the windshield, smashing the glass and completely blocking Ted's view with a wall of pine needles and wood. He was now driving blind at 60 mph, with a forest covering his glass. Panic set in. Instead of braking smoothly in a straight line, Ted jerked the steering wheel to the right, instinctively trying to shake the obstruction off his car. The car careened across 3 lanes of traffic. He miraculously missed the other cars, but found the one thing he couldn't miss: the solid concrete support pillar of an overpass. The impact was brutal. The car wrapped around the pillar. The tree, ironically, acted as a battering ram, crushing the cabin further upon impact. Ted was found amidst a scene that looked like a logging truck accident inside a sedan. He died instantly of massive internal trauma. He wanted to save $20 on delivery, but he paid the ultimate price, proving that aerodynamics isn't just a suggestion, and that bungee cords are not, and never will be, structural fasteners. 9. The escalator Santayu. Alcohol and heavy machinery are a bad mix. Alcohol, escalators, and a restrictive, vision-impairing Santa suit are a fatal one. This brings us to Gary, a 45-year-old seasonal mall Santa who had just finished his final shift on Christmas Eve. Gary was burnt out, tired of crying children, and ready to celebrate. He had toasted the end of the season with a few too many spiked coffees at the mall food court with the other elves. Feeling jolly, invincible, and significantly impaired, he decided to give the lingering shoppers a show as he left the mall. He approached the long, steep central escalator that spanned the 3-story atrium. "Ho, ho, ho," he bellowed, ignoring the stand right, walk left etiquette. Instead of walking down, Gary decided to hop onto the wide black rubber handrail. He intended to slide down it like a cool action movie hero, waving to his fans. Now, escalator handrails are not designed for human cargo. They are often greasy from maintenance. They move at a slightly different speed than the steps to prevent bunching, and they are curved. Gary's synthetic velvet Santa pants offered zero friction against the rubber. He accelerated instantly. He was flying. But halfway down, near the second-floor landing, he hit a bump where the handrail segments joined. His center of gravity, already shifted by his fake belly padding and the heavy sack of props on his back, threw him off balance. He tilted to the right, away from the stairs and toward the open atrium. There was no safety net, just a 30-foot drop to the tile floor below. Gary toppled over the side of the moving handrail, legs flailing. He fell 3 stories through the festive air, passing the giant mall Christmas tree on his way down, looking like a discarded ornament. Shoppers gasped in horror as a screaming Santa plummeted past the second floor. He landed directly on top of a Hickory Farms sausage kiosk on the ground floor. The impact was devastating. He didn't bounce, he broke. He died on an impact among the crushed summer sausages and cheese logs, traumatizing a generation of children who were waiting in line for a last-minute photo. Gary wanted to make a memorable exit, and he succeeded. He is now the reason that mall has "Do not ride handrails" signs posted every 5 feet. He proved that the laws of gravity apply even to St. Nick, and that the only thing sliding down a handrail gets you is a fast pass to the morgue. 10. The Reindeer Rodeo. We conclude with the story of Brad, a 24-year-old frat brother who thought animals were just fuzzy props for his social media content. Brad was at a pop-up winter wonderland, petting zoo and Christmas market in the city. He was intoxicated on overpriced craft beer and unearned hubris. In the center of the zoo was a high-fenced pen holding a massive male reindeer, a bull caribou. The animal was in rut, a period of high testosterone and aggression where males fight for dominance. But to Brad, it just looked like a cute, oversized version of the cartoon Rudolph. "I'm gonna ride him," Brad announced to his friends, handing one his phone to livestream the event for his 12 followers. He hopped the double-reinforced fence, ignoring the bright red "Danger Wild Animals" signs. He approached the reindeer, arms wide, making cooing noises. The reindeer lowered its head, staring at him. This wasn't a submissive greeting. It was a combat stance. Reindeer are not horses. They are wild animals of the tundra designed to pull sleighs and fight wolves. As Brad tried to throw his leg over the animal's back for the ultimate selfie, the reindeer exploded into action. The animal whipped its head up with terrifying speed. Its antlers, which are essentially multi-pronged bone spears, caught Brad in the chest and abdomen. The force was immense. Like being hit by a motorcycle, it tossed him into the air like a rag doll. When Brad landed in the sawdust, the animal proceeded to trample him, viewing him not as a rider, but as a rival male invading its territory. By the time the zookeepers could intervene with tranquilizers, the damage was done. Brad had suffered multiple puncture wounds to his lungs and crushed ribs. He died on the floor of the pen, his phone still recording the blurry aftermath from where it had fallen. Brad wanted to be a legend on Instagram, but he ended up as a cautionary statistic on the evening news. He forgot that reindeer are wild beasts, not rides at Disneyland, and that trying to rodeo a caribou is a great way to get canceled. Permanently. Okay, we've seen the fatal fails. Now for the near misses. What's the single dumbest thing you've seen a friend or family member do on Christmas that should have won them an award, but they somehow survived? Describe the moment you thought, well, he's dead. The most terrifying survival story gets pinned. Subscribe to stay on this side of the statistics. 901. That concludes our holiday autopsy. Now, I want chaos in the comments. Pick one of these absolute disasters and try to defend their logic. Tell me why the sparkler bomb or the sofa sleigh seemed like a genius idea at the time. Smash like if you value your limbs, and subscribe so we can judge more bad decisions together.